Okay, so welcome to this Legal Aid New South Wales Law Week webinar, Your Neighbours and the Law. My name is Kerry Wright and I work in the Community Legal Education branch at Legal Aid New South Wales. I'm here today with Bridget Barker from Legal Aid New South Wales and Lynn Davey from the Community Justice Centre. We also have two Auslan interpreters. Hi everyone.
Good morning, it's good to be here.
That's great. Unfortunately, Bridget hasn't joined us yet. She will be with us very soon. To begin, I want to acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners and custodians on whose land we are broadcasting from today, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar today or viewing the recording. The information today is general legal information only. It's not legal advice, but we'll tell you where you can send your clients for specific legal advice at the end. There's a handout of the presentation we're using today on the control panel, so you can download that and follow along if you'd like to do that. So, Lynn, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Yes, thanks Kerry. So I've been a mediator for over 20 years and I've been working for the Community Justice Centre for 15 years. I've mediated hundreds of disputes during that time and I'm looking forward to talking about some of those today, specifically neighbour disputes. And you know, I can tell you that the top three neighbour disputes are boundary fences, overhanging trees and barking dogs. So I look forward to sharing that with you a bit later on in the presentation.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, we'll definitely be looking at that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to launch a quick poll with our audience. So I'll just launch that now so people can see that on their screen. So we want to know if you've heard before about Legal Aid New South Wales, Community Justice Centres, LawAccess New South Wales, or the Legal Problem Guided Pathways. You can choose more than one response to share with our presenters. Okay, I'll close that poll and share it with everyone. So, Lynn, can you see that, the responses? Everyone's heard of Legal Aid New South Wales.
Yes.
Community Justice Centres, quite a lot of people have heard of those, so that's good. And LawAccess New South Wales. Nobody's heard of the Legal Problem Guided Pathways, so that's good because we're going to talk about that today. So the next slide is to tell you all what we're going to be talking about today. So we will talk about Legal Aid New South Wales, we will talk about community justice centres, guided pathways, common neighbour issues, which Lynn's mentioned, fences, trees and noise, and we'll answer your questions. And as I've said, we're only providing legal information today, not legal advice. And on this slide, there's a picture of a little book that's called Neighbours and the Law. This is available in all public libraries in New South Wales. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a little video about Legal Aid New South Wales. So I'll just bring that up for you all to have a look.
How can Legal Aid New South Wales help me? Legal Aid is a legal service for people in New South Wales. We can help in lots of ways, not just if you're in trouble with police, going to court or in jail. Let's say you're finding it hard to pay some fines and are behind in your home loan payments. To make things worse, your ex-partner wants to take the kids. Life feels like a tangled knot. Your friend tells you to call our helpline. It's called LawAccess New South Wales. They tell you Legal Aid has lawyers who can help you. You make an appointment and take along your fines and other papers. You can see us at a community organisation or the legal aid office near you. Legal advice is free and you can get an interpreter for free too. You're nervous, but our lawyer is friendly and patient and really knows what they're talking about. What you discuss is confidential, which means we can't tell anyone what you say unless you agree. The legal aid lawyer calls the bank for you. They agree to give you a break from paying your loan for a few months. We help you make an appointment with a financial counsellor to sort out your money problems. We also explain that because you're in serious financial hardship, there are different ways to deal with your fines. And about the trouble with your ex-partner, we can talk to you about that too. You feel much better after talking to Legal Aid. Legal Aid New South Wales can help you untangle many legal problems, like with your housing, your job, Centrelink, police troubles, visas, domestic violence, divorce, child support and more. Or if you just think something is unfair, we can tell you if the law can help. Call 1300 888 529 or search online for Legal Aid New South Wales.
Or search online for legal.
Okay. So that was just a very short video about Legal Aid New South Wales, just to give you an idea of the types of legal problems that Legal Aid New South Wales can help with, which, as you can see, there are many of them, and how to get in touch with us, but we'll repeat that number at the end of the webinar. So now we're going to give you a chance to talk to us. Lynn, can you tell us about community justice centres?
I'd love to. So the community justice centres are funded by the New South Wales state government, and they have been in operation in New South Wales for more than 30 years. We're part of the Department of Communities and Justice. It's a free service, so it's available to anyone in New South Wales who is living in New South Wales and is having a dispute. They can contact the community justice centres, and we'll do an intake process with our case coordinators on the phone or on the website, which will give you the details for that later. And a case coordinator will do the initial conversation with people to determine whether or not your matter might be suitable for mediation. It is a voluntary process, so we have to make sure that everyone's agreed to come to mediation, and it's a great first step to trying to resolve the dispute. It's confidential. As a mediator, I've taken an oath that I won't disclose any details about what takes place in a mediation or any other type of dispute resolution process that we might use. I take that very seriously, and I ask people in mediation to also respect that confidentiality. We do all kinds of disputes. So neighbour disputes, workplace, community organisations, parenting plans, property settlements, money matters, any kind of dispute can come to the CJC mediation. Will that do for now, Kerry? Or do you want me to expand on something there?
Yeah, that's fine. And I see on the slide, Lynn, that neighbour disputes are the most common in community justice centres. So I assume you've seen quite a few of those.
I have mediated hundreds of neighbour disputes over the years, and I'm very pleased to say that over 76% of those matters that go to mediation will reach an outcome that they can both live with. So an agreement, which I'll talk about a bit later during the process.
Okay, well, let's move on to that now, Lynn. Tell us about Community Justice Centre mediations. What are they? How do they work?
So, despite the picture in front of you, we're not an animal shelter, but we are providing a safe space for people to come together and talk. So if you look at the first diagram there, you've got two people back to back, obviously not listening to each other. They've got some kind of dispute going on, and that escalates, and you can see the tension that's mounting in the second picture there. And then you've got a full-on, you know, flight mode in the third one there, where people are doing whatever they can to stay away from each other. Communication's totally broken down at that stage. So what we do is we say, okay, come on guys, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's talk about what the issues are, and let's see if you can come up with something that you can live with to find a way forward. And the way that we're doing that, as you can see in those last two pictures, is that we're asking you just for a moment to step into the other person's shoes and try and comprehend what it's like for them. There's always two perspectives, we know that. And it's not about judging, it's not about saying who's right and who's wrong. It's about giving people the opportunity to open up those communication lines and to really try and work through the issues. And it's important that that I mentioned that we're not trying to turn people into their new best friends, and we're not trying to change people. If we were doing that, we would have gone out of business a long time ago. But what we are trying to do is resolve conflict. And if you can say to people, you know, how's your life at the moment? Is, you know, other things that you want to change, then that's a good starting point as far as participating in mediation.
Okay, and Lynn, we've had a question from one of our audience members saying, are there particular kinds of neighbour disputes that are less likely to be resolved in mediation?
I don't know about less likely, but more challenging, I guess, are the ones that are referred by the courts, New South Wales courts. They can make a mandatory referral for mediation when if someone has applied for an apprehended personal violence order and an application is before the court and the magistrate has suggested that those people try and talk things out at mediation. It's a mandatory referral, but as far as the Community Justice Centre is concerned, it's still a voluntary process. And we do some pretty intensive work before we put the people together to make sure that they're willing to negotiate. Those ones, I guess, are quite challenging because when you've got to the point of a court application, obviously the dispute has escalated. So the sooner that we can get in and try and, you know, assist people with the dispute, then the more likelihood that you'll have a good outcome for those people.
That's great. Thanks, Lynn. So we're now going to move forward on guided pathways. And before we get into some common neighbourhood dispute topics, we want to talk about the new online guided pathways that you can find on the Legal Aid the LawAccess New South Wales website. We'll send the link to this page will be in the follow-up email after the webinar. Essentially, they are self-help tools that aim to help people resolve their legal problem quickly, cheaply and fairly without having to go to court. The guided pathway allows you to work through a problem that you have by answering a series of questions and then provides you with tailored information based on your situation. The aim is to help people who can help themselves. It can be hard with the amount of information that's online to know what type of legal problem you have and identify what it is and what information out there is most relevant to you. The guided pathways are a way to help people who want to or can self-assist to identify that legal issue and gives them the steps to take to resolve that legal issue on their own. You can see on the slide there's a number of different guided pathways. I think there's 9 in total. We'll be talking about resolving fencing disputes today in this webinar, and the webinar following this we're going to look at 2 other ones, being chase for money and recovering money. So I think Bridget has now joined us. Is that right, Bridget?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So
Sorry.
Bridget, hopefully you can catch up where we're up to. We're up to this slide, which shows us that neighbour problems are common. And here's some statistics from LawAccess New South Wales. Do you want to go through those, or would you like me to?
I'm happy to go through them.
Thanks,
Kerry,
Bridget.
thank you. So These are the neighbour problems that LawAccess encountered in 2018 to 19. The greatest proportion were disputes about fences, trees, and animals. That was 76% of the calls to LawAccess during that period. 18% were other neighbour disputes, and then 6% were disputes dealing with noise, nuisance, and pollution. So as you can see, a lot of the work that LawAccess does is responding to calls about neighbour problems.
Yes. And then we have this little news articles that shows that neighbour disputes can get nasty. Okay,
They sure can, yeah.
So this is our first key message for our webinar participants. Dealing with issues early can help you avoid a dispute, and Lynn certainly talked about that. So these are our 3 topics we're going to talk about today: fences, trees, noises, and animals, which we've just shown that LawAccess that they're common, and also Lynn spoke about that, Bridget, before you joined us, that they were the most common neighbour disputes she's helped with at CJC. So want to take us through this scenario, Bridget?
Okay, so the first scenario that we're going to talk about is a fencing issue. Frank wants to replace an old paling fence with a new ColourBond one. He spoke to his neighbour Lynn, but Lynn doesn't want ColourBond. So what can Frank do? What we would suggest is talk to his neighbour first. He's done that. He may need to have a series of conversations with his neighbour, but the next step Frank could take is to have a look at the guided pathway called Resolving Fencing Disputes that is on LawAccess. The third option is to call LawAccess for free legal help. So now, Kerry, we're going to have a look at the guided pathway for Frank, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Where am I going to find that? Here. Can you see that now, Bridget?
I can. So everybody, if you go to the LawAccess website, there's a tile on the very front page, which is called Guided Pathways. And if you click on the link there, that will take you through a number of different options.
It's coming up now.
So as you can see, there's a few to choose from, but we're going to have a look at resolving fencing disputes for Frank.
I brought that up, so I click next.
I was just going to mention that there are some icons that you can look at. That if you see the question mark, if you hover your mouse over it, it gives you a little definition.
I've done that on boundary. A boundary is the line dividing 2 properties, it says.
Thanks, Kerry. So Frank wants to do fencing work, so we'll click on the first option.
Yes.
Then there's some information there, and the next option is that I want to
communicate with my neighbour.
I want to communicate with my neighbour. So they've had a first conversation, but that's probably what should be the next best option.
And
they haven't been able to come to an agreement, so we'll say no there. So the options are either to try mediation through the Community Justice Centre or to send the neighbour a fencing notice. Now, we would always suggest people try mediation first. So we'll select that one. And then it brings up some information for you about mediation, including a link to the Community Justice Centre's website.
I think that's the end, is it, Bridget?
I think that will be the last. Yeah, you've reached the end of the guided pathway. So that just gives you an idea of how they work. There's
Okay.
questions to answer at each step.
All right. So we've gone back to our slides. So now we're up to this slide, Bridget.
So Frank and Lynn agree to go to mediation through the Community Justice Centre. But now that Frank has had a look at the guided pathway, he also knows he can send a fencing notice and apply for a fencing order in the local court or NCAT. So that's more information that was on the guided pathway that Frank could have followed through by selecting different options.
So what I'm going to do is a quick poll with our audience now. So I'll launch that. And the poll is, the first thing to do if you have a dispute about a fence is to send a fencing order, true or false. So I'm just getting our audience to vote, and then I will share that with you both, the response. So 100% said false. Is that right, Bridget?
Yes, thanks everybody. You're obviously listening well. We agree with that.
That's brilliant. Okay, so this is our next key message. It's best to come to an agreement either directly or through mediation, as we just talked about. So, Lynn, we've got another situation here. Do you want to take us through this one?
Sure, yeah. So Kerry has a large tree on her property and Chris wants the tree removed because it's leaning over the fence and causing damage. So Kerry's saying it's a native and the local council wouldn't allow her to remove it, but Chris doesn't actually believe this. So what can they do?
So how can the Community Justice Centre help them?
Okay, so either one of those people can contact us directly, and we do an intake with the case coordinator who will ask them questions similar to what you've just been talking about. What steps have you taken to try and fix this? Have you tried to talk to your neighbour? Have you got legal information, you know, about the tree and what might happen to it? And if it's sounding like they've tried a few things like that, but they're not getting anywhere, then what we will do is write to their neighbour. So we'll take their details, we'll take the neighbour's details, we'll send them a letter and we'll say, could you contact the Community Justice Centre? You know, your neighbour would like to try and organise mediation with you. As I've said earlier, it's a voluntary process. So if we hear from the neighbours and we've got agreement to go ahead and organise mediation, then we'll go ahead and do that. If they don't respond to the letter, we'll send them a friendly follow-up letter, and the whole letter process takes about 3 weeks. So, you know, it can take a while to organise mediation depending on, you know, when we hear from people and what their availability is like. With COVID, we're restricted to telephone mediations and Skype and other audio-visual means of people communicating. So that's thrown up a few challenges for people. I personally feel it's better to sit face to face in a room and talk to somebody, but we haven't been able to do that in the last 12 months or so. But once we've got agreement to organise mediation, then we'll organise a date and time and we'll set up the telephone conference call. And I'm just going to run through quickly what we say to people at the beginning of mediation about the process. So we're asking, I've forgotten the names of the people now who were having problems, whatever their names were.
Kerry and Chris.
Thank you. So we ask them to give us a summary and an overview of what the issues are from each of their perspectives, because we know that if there's issues on one side, there'll be issues on the other side. So we ask people to listen. It's very important to listen as well as speak in mediation. And then when they've both finished giving their summaries, we summarise back what we've heard each of them say. And from that, we put a list, usually on a whiteboard, but again, we can't do that over the phone. But it's the things that they've identified that they need to talk about to try and resolve the issues between them. Because we look at it a bit like an iceberg. I mean, the fence might be the presenting problem, the initial reason that they're giving for mediation. but you can usually guarantee that there's other things going on underneath. So you know how with an iceberg, you have the iceberg at the top that's showing on the surface of the water, and you've got all that great mass underneath. So we're trying to get to those underlying issues, because if you can sort some of those things out, then they might be able to come to a decision about what they're going to do with the fence. But while they're both in oppositional corners and they're not looking at the other person's perspective and they're only focused on what their needs are, then you're not going to get very far. So once we have that list, we're saying to people, you really need to start talking to each other directly. And as the mediator, I would help with that. I can ask questions if something needs to be clarified. And if they get stuck, I can help them to move on, because quite often people do get in a bit of a cycle of conflict. So we do that for as long as it takes, and mediation can take 2 to 3 hours, which is quite heavy going, particularly on the phone. But as long as they're making progress and they're moving forward, and we're checking in with them. And once they've worked their way through that list of issues, we do disconnect the conference call and we have some private time, confidential time with each of them. That's important, especially on the phone, because we don't have any visual cues as to what's happening for that person, if they're getting angry or upset or whatever may be happening. So we check in with them and we say, is there any concerns? Is there anything you want to share with us about the mediation? And we also get them thinking about, well, where do we go from here? What happens next? You've spent all this time talking about the past. You've been talking about the issues. When we come back together, it's about negotiating the future. What suggestions, what outcomes can you put on the table to try and resolve this dispute? Now, as a mediator, I'm completely impartial and neutral. I'm not taking sides in the dispute. And I'm not telling people what to do. Any outcomes, any suggestions that they make and negotiate are ones that they've talked about during the mediation. We can write it up, and if they do reach agreement, we can write it up in what's called a good faith agreement. There is the capacity to turn that into a legal document by taking it to their legal representatives, but because we're not a legal entity in the community justice centres, we're focusing on that good faith agreement. But it's written in their own words, and it's a record of the things that they've talked about at mediation. And once they have that agreement and they go away, well, hopefully they've sorted out what they're going to do with the fence, and they're able to move on and remove a whole lot of stress and conflict from their lives, hopefully.
Yes, and the slide I've just brought up, Lynn, says that through community justice centres, 76% of neighbour dispute mediations result in agreement and resolution. So that's incredibly impressive.
They're good stats. Too. Absolutely, it's very rewarding when people can go away with, removing that conflict. And I think part of the reason it's so successful is because of that voluntary nature of mediation, so that when people say yes to mediation, there's already an amount of goodwill there, that they're willing to. They might have some things they want to get off their chest, in mediation, and that's the perfect place to do it. But then they're able to move on. So I believe it's a process that's worked very well for a lot of years.
So in our little scenario, what we've got here is what happened at mediation. Kerry and Chris explained their thoughts and agreed on a plan, like Lynn said would happen. Chris agreed he would write to the council to find out if they'd prevent the tree's removal, and Kerry would get advice from a qualified tree specialist and have the tree removed if they said it would cause damage. And they agreed to share the costs of removing the tree if necessary. So just a summary, what can they do? They can talk to each other first, obviously. They could contact the local council to check if there is a tree preservation order. They can try mediation through the CJC. And as a last resort, they could seek an order from the Land and Environment Court. So that's a great summary of that dispute. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
So we're now going to do another poll, a few polls with our audience based on what we've just talked about. So we'll just grab one of those. This is our first one. If you know a tree is dangerous, you may have to pay for damage to your neighbour if it falls in a storm. True or false? So let's have a look and see. People are voting, I think. All right, I'll close that and share the results with you. So 67% said true and 33% said false. Bridget, do you have the answer to this poll?
It's true. So 67% of you were correct. If you know that a tree is dangerous, you have that knowledge and it does fall and cause damage, then you would be liable to pay for the damage.
Okay, I'll launch our next one. So this one is the Land and Environment Court can only deal with disputes about trees that can cause damage or obstruct views or sunlight. True or false? So I'm taking some questions, some voting's happening now, and I'll close that in a couple of seconds so that we've got everyone's. So I'll close that and share. So 40% said true and 60% said false. What was the answer there?
So
Bridget?
40% of you were correct. It's true that in relation to trees, the Land and Environment Court can only deal with disputes where there's a tree could cause damage or injury, or if it is severely obstructing a view or sunlight.
Okay.
So we're all learning something today.
Our next poll is about it's important not to trespass onto your neighbour's property if pruning or removing trees. True or false? So just waiting for people to vote on this one of our participants, and we have a question about that too. So I'll just close the poll and share it with you all, and then I'll share the results. 100% of people have said true. How about that one, Bridget?
Well, you're all right. Of course, if you speak with your neighbour and they agree that you can go onto their property to do some pruning, that's a different matter, but you don't have a right to just trespass on your neighbour's property.
So, Bridget, we had a question from one of our audience members. What about the trimming of trees? Who is responsible? Is that something they could
If there's a tree that's overhanging in your yard from a neighbour, if it's the neighbour's tree, you can trim the branches back to the fence line, and you can ask your neighbour to deal with what you've trimmed from the tree. But as anything with neighbours, a common sense approach is to chat to them and try and resolve it between you rather than letting things escalate.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. So we're now going to talk about noise and animals. So we'll move on. Oh, did everyone hear that? That was a noisy dog. So annoyed by the noise from a neighbour's dog, what should you do? So Bridget, do you want to take us through this slide?
Sure. So if you are experiencing an issue with noise from a neighbour's dog, as with other disputes or problems, the first step would be to try and talk to your neighbour about it, and see if you can alert them to the problem and see if you can work out a solution between you. If that's not possible, or it's something that they don't feel they can address themselves, then the next step we would suggest that you take is to try mediation through the community justice centres. Other options available if discussion with your neighbour or mediation don't help to resolve the dispute are, under the law, you could apply to council, who can issue a dog nuisance order. Council can also issue a noise prevention notice. You can complain to the police, and they do have the ability to issue a noise abatement direction. And lastly, you can apply to the local court for a noise abatement order. Of course, which option you take will depend on your relationship with your neighbour, how willing each of you are to try and resolve the dispute. Sometimes, even though we think that's the best option, sometimes it's just not possible. So there are these other options available using the law.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll do our last poll with our audience. If you are annoyed by the noise of a neighbour's dog, should you, and you can choose more than one answer, talk to your neighbour, contact the CJC to arrange a mediation, get an equally noisy dog? So we're just waiting for our audience to vote, everyone to vote, and then I'll share their responses with you. Okay, so here's the responses we got. So 100% said talk to your neighbour, 60% contact the CJC, and 20% thought we should get an equally noisy dog. Okay, well, that's going to be an interesting scenario. Hopefully they're enjoying the humour behind that one, and but I guess that does happen. So we'll hide that response and we'll move on to other neighbour issues. Do you want to take us through this one, Bridget?
Sure. So other neighbour issues that we see at Legal Aid, and I'm sure the Community Justice Centre sees from time to time, are issues of violence, harassment and intimidation. And some options of what you can do in that situation is, obviously, if there's violence, you can call the police. You could try mediation at the Community Justice Centre if it's appropriate, depending on the situation. You could also apply to the local court for an apprehended personal violence order. And that's an order that the court can make where there are conditions placed on what the neighbour can and can't do, and that's those orders are made to provide you with protection from the violence or harassment or intimidation that you've been experiencing. Other disputes are strata disputes. If you have a strata dispute, New South Wales Fair Trading offer a free mediation service. The Seniors' Rights Service also has a specialist strata service, so that's another place that you can go to for some advice and information. Complaints about Airbnb. This is something that didn't exist a while ago. If you have a problem in relation to a neighbour who has an Airbnb, you need to report those issues to Airbnb directly. I would have thought also that it might be something that you could discuss with your local council. Your council might have some rules that they've put in place in relation to Airbnb in your particular area.
Yeah, more and more, I think. And also on this slide, there's a little picture there of the booklet Neighbours and the Law, which, as I mentioned at the start, is available in all public libraries. And the links to some of the organisations that we've mentioned here are also in the email that'll follow the webinar. So thanks, Bridget. So our next slide is giving you the phone number for LawAccess New South Wales, 1300 888 529. You can ring them for free legal help and referral to the most appropriate legal service, depending on your legal problem. So this is not just for neighbours, but any legal problem you may have, they'll help you work out if it is a legal problem and who can help. So they're open from 9 AM to 5 PM, Monday to Friday. And that's the best way to access Legal Aid New South Wales as well now. So in terms of resources, you can also visit the Find Legal Answers legal toolkits, which are in all public libraries, but also online at the State Library of New South Wales, and the web address is there on the slide. And there's also that little booklet that I was talking about, which there's hard copies in the libraries, but there's also, you can view it online on the Find Legal Answers website if you're not close to your local public library. And of course you can contact the community justice centres, who are your best friend when it comes to resolving neighbour disputes, I think. And yeah, so this is the end of our webinar, so we're happy to take any final questions. We did have one question a bit earlier on, which was if this person knows an older person who has to pay each year to trim the neighbour's overhanging branches, what can they do? What would you say to them, Bridget, if you had that person ring up for legal advice?
I would suggest in the first instance that they try and speak with their neighbour and let them know. The neighbour may be unaware that they have to pay someone to trim the branches. It's hard to know without what advice to give without knowing a little bit more about the circumstances, but it is hard for older people. They don't have the strength to trim branches, and the neighbour may be younger and may be able to do it if they were made aware that that is an issue. If that's not a possible way to resolve it, then I would suggest trying to contact the Community Justice Centre to mediate the problem, and through that they may be able to get some agreement about the neighbour bearing the cost, or perhaps both parties sharing the cost of it, so that the older person doesn't have to bear the full cost themselves.
And so, Lynn, is that something that you often see in your mediations?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's about, you know, understanding what's happening for that other person, and they may not even be aware that the person, you know, doesn't have someone that can come and do that, and that they're, you know, financially they're not in a position to pay someone. And I think once they get that awareness and they realise that the person is not doing it just to be difficult, they're doing it because they're actually struggling, well, then you're part of the way there. So that's a really relevant discussion in mediation. You know, it's about those very personal issues and the impact that it's having on people. And quite often in that situation, they will find another way around that. That means that, you know, the other person is not struggling financially, and, you know, there's lots of creative things that that people come up with in mediation to deal with those issues.
Another possibility is if the older person has had an ACAT assessment and has a package where they're eligible for help, they may be able to use some of that package to get gardening help and have some subsidised gardening work done. But again, it depends on the person's circumstances.
Okay, thank you. We haven't had any more questions typed in, so obviously the information you provided has been pretty comprehensive. So I'd just like to thank both you, Bridget and Lynn, for your time today in talking about neighbours and the law. And thanks to our Auslan interpreters, Kelly and Kat, who have been working away in the background while we've been talking. And thanks to everyone who's come along and participated in the webinar today. And a reminder that when we close the webinar today, you'll get a survey, and we'd really appreciate your feedback about this webinar, and an email which will have links to the resources that we've talked about today. So, and also just a reminder that we've recorded this webinar and it will go up on the Legal Aid New South Wales YouTube channel possibly this afternoon. So we'll probably close the webinar now because we don't have any other questions, and some of you might be joining us a bit later on at our next webinar for Law Week, which is about your money and the law. So I will close the webinar and say goodbye to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.